You're listening to the award-winning Philadelphia Hall Monitor here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHM WPPM. Tonight on the program, we'll be joined by Councilmember Mark Squilla as he walks us through the 76er proposal. Councilmember Rue Landau will discuss LGBTQ protections, and Lance Haver will provide updates on SEPTA's new pact with its unions. And Denise and I, later in the show, will tell you more about the arena hearings going on in City Council this week. Denise, how are you today?
Well, I could use a snack and a nap.
We've had a busy couple of days.
Mhm.
We've been in those hearings all day, yesterday and today. We're going to tell you a lot about that. Before we do that, though, we're going to have Councilmember Mark Squilla explain to you his perspective on where the arena negotiations are right now and walk us through some of the legislation and some of the questions that we've been getting about it. This is a longer interview, just like our interview with Councilmember Landau. So we're going to play half of it today and the other half next week. Okay? And we're going to do the same with Councilmember Landau's interview. So here is the first half of our interview with Councilmember Mark Squilla.
Thank you very much for sitting down with us.
Thank you.
You're in the hot spot talking about the arena, and we've been covering it, and to be honest, some of it's very confusing, so we thought before we talk to you about your position, we'd like to make sure we're reporting the facts correctly, because while we welcome difference of opinion, we shouldn't really welcome difference of facts, right? If we're wrong, we'd like to get corrected.
Yeah, and I think it's important, obviously, to have those conversations, and sometimes too, even when you get the answers, there's still a little bit of whether you understand it, wholeheartedly. And as we go through this process, even myself, as I've gone through this process, learning what has happened in the past compared to what is happening now, and how all these processes play in, the ability to build a new arena. And, I'm sure even after this case, when they rebuild, whether it's the Link or Citizens Bank Park, it'll be a whole another process.
Right, in the
so
old,
that,
so that's a good place to begin. So the proposed arena, the city will actually end up owning all the land. That's right.
for the life of the lease.
Right, 30 years.
Right.
And then the city doesn't lease it to the Sixers, they lease it to the Pennsylvania Authority for Industrial Development, PAVE. Why doesn't the city just lease it directly to the Sixers?
I'm not sure of that answer, but I know that that's what has happened in the past through the other arenas and stadiums that were built in the city of Philadelphia, that their agreement is with PAID. It is a quasi-governmental agency, and all the functions that we have, we use PAID sort of as the conduit to do those type of leases.
PAID doesn't pay anything to the city for the lease, and the owners of the Sixers, the owners of the arena, they won't pay anything for the lease either, is that right?
Correct.
But after 30 years, they end up getting all the land back.
Well, 30 years or the life of the lease. So if the lease is extended,
I see.
So if the lease is extended, say they extend it for 5 years and they're still playing games there, then it would still maintain the same structure. Once that lease is no longer valid or the arena goes dark, it would then revert back to the owner's ownership parcel, and the city wouldn't be stuck with a gigantic empty arena that is probably worth nothing.
So, because the city is technically the owner, there's no real estate taxes owed. Is that right?
Correct.
To make up for that, there's an agreement with the ownership of the team that they're going to make a payment in lieu of taxes, what we call a pilot. But the pilot isn't based on the value of the stadium, right? So the pilot itself is, they're proposing paying $5 million a year.
Well, it comes out to $6 million with UNO payments that go
Right,
through.
but UNO, I'm going to ask you about UNO, because one of the things I have found out is, I know you know what UNO is, but I have found
Use and
out,
occupancy.
unfortunately, our viewers, UNO is a really strange concept to them. You pay real estate taxes and you pay some other taxes, kind of like real estate, but it isn't, it has a different name, but it's kind of
We could have
the
a whole
same.
conversation on
Right.
why that was created, and it was basically created because we have a uniformity clause in our tax structure, right? And to assess you can't assess different values on real estate, whether it's commercial or residential. So this was a way to have the commercial properties pay additional tax without going against the uniformity clause.
So if the arena, the owners are gonna pay $1.5 billion to put the land and the arena together. If the arena is assessed at $1 billion, the actual real estate taxes based on property tax rates, they should be paying $14 million a year.
Well, arenas, you gotta, I don't know if you could say that, because the arenas, you have to follow the state law. There was a state law created in 2001 when we built both the Link and the Citizens Bank Park. At that point, no arenas or stadiums ever paid any taxes, right? Because first of all, it was always paid back through this lease agreement on city land, so there was no taxes. And so what the state decided to do was they came up with a program saying, all right, yes, this is still state land, right? But every arena in the state is now going to have to follow this process of a pilot. So instead of being tax-free, there will be some tax revenue now that been negotiated between the entity and the municipality to pay taxes to that municipality instead of not paying any taxes on government land.
So if you were to calculate backwards, the $5 million payment that they're agreeing to pay would set the value of the arena at $357 million. And here's where I get lost.
Okay.
None of the owners of the team are unskilled. These are all billionaires. These are incredibly skilled business people.
Right.
It's just hard for someone like me to believe that these business people are going to spend $1.5 billion for something that's worth $350 million.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I don't know how you, because if you have a state law that you have to follow on arenas that are negotiated through this pilot that is now there, you're saying, well, all right, if it's going to cost you $1 billion, then you have to give the city $100 million a year instead of $5 million a year,
I'm saying,
or whatever it is.
I'm asking why they're not agreeing. I understand that they're paying a pilot because the city owns the land.
Right.
But I'm asking about the amount of the pilot, why it isn't the equivalent of, say, real estate taxes I pay, or that you pay. Right.
Well, because the goal of that bill initially was so that they couldn't move. In other words, for the life of the lease, when they came up with the state law, at least from what I understand, and we'll have to talk to the people who created that back in 2001, but from what I understand was they were given their right to move. They cannot move for the life of the lease, and in order to do that, they would negotiate a pilot tax program where if I have my ability to leave, like they can't just abandon that property in 30 years. They still have to pay that pilot for the life of that lease. If somebody comes and buys the 76ers, they still have to follow that same guideline. Where other people could just get up and leave and move, they cannot do that because of the state law. So our issue is every other arena and every other stadium that we look at, you're sort of creating apples and oranges by saying that, because you're saying if somebody were to build a high rise there that was worth $1.5 billion, right, then they would pay additional taxes, but then again, they would also get a 10-year tax abatement, right, so they would pay nothing for 10 years. So you're sort of conflating the numbers in the sense that would say it doesn't seem fair. But
So-
when you're talking about an arena, let's talk about how arenas are taxed throughout the Commonwealth.
Right. But if it were a private investment, even though they would get the 10-year tax abatement, for years 11 through 30, they would pay much more real estate taxes than what the Sixers are going to pay in pilots.
But how do we know if anybody would even build it there?
We don't.
Right? You don't. I mean,
everything's a risk.
Yeah, exactly.
Everything's a risk.
And we also have to look what's there now.
Right.
Right? What is the revenue and taxes now?
At the end of the discussion, I'm going to raise that point.
Okay.
But so let's talk then about the use and occupancy tax, because there is no 10-year abatement for that.
No.
And as you point out, it is a complicated situation where, because the state has a requirement that all taxes are at the same rate, the city tried to do something progressive and say commercial real estate should pay at a higher rate than residential real estate, The state law didn't allow the city to do that, so the city created a use and occupancy tax. And it's, to make it even more confusing, it's not the same rate as the real estate tax, right? One's 1.4, one's 1.2.
You have to prepay it, there's a lot of different things that are
It
involved
just
in that.
very,
tax.
and you have to
Right.
pay it monthly and all of that. But everybody, every other business has to pay that. Under this lease agreement, the Sixers don't have to pay a use and occupancy tax.
Yeah.
They get to pay $500,000 as opposed to the 1.2% of $1 billion.
Right, well, UNO is based on the square footage of, it's not based on your value, right? So if you have certain square footage of retail space, you only pay UNO on that. You might have apartments above, you don't pay UNO on that, right? So you're not paying UNO on the value of what it costs you to build the building. So it's only the square footage of your retail space.
Right, so why then don't they just pay the regular UNO tax? Why do they have a special deal?
I mean, that was part of the state law, right? The state law that created, I mean, I guess we could go back and look at our state law and say, you know, why don't we just carve certain things out, or why don't we just say you could pay a tax based on something different? But the way the state law, from what I understand, reads that it's negotiated with the municipality.
Right.
And that they will be able to say, all right, we don't know what your square footage is even going to be, right, of retail space. And so therefore you might pay, I don't know, maybe you pay $1 million a year in UNO, but we're going to let you pay $500,000. You know, as the administration was doing this, they were looking at previous arenas or stadiums that were built in the city and looked at what they were paying, and I think tried to compare that and come up what they thought was the best value for the city of Philadelphia. But I mean, if we want to go back and talk to our state colleagues and see if we want to change that law, I think we could do that. But if now we have to follow that law and make that negotiations to do, you know, to look at what it is that we're receiving in a $1.5 billion project, and how we as a city then could capture a guaranteed tax revenue through that. Because like we were saying earlier, there's tax revenue that's coming from buildings that were built that cost a lot of money, and say that they cost $1 billion to build, but now they can't rent office space anymore. You're not getting that full value of taxes or UNO, right? So now all of a sudden you're decreasing the value of what the city gets, and we're not going to do that with this deal, because we're going to have a $6 million payment, well, average $6 million payment throughout the 30 years.
Right.
So, I mean, that fluctuates too, and I think this gives us a guarantee for the life of the lease, and then if they extend the lease, they will still have to continue to pay.
Right, but it is significantly less than if they were paying a regular real estate
No,
tax.
I don't see how you
So,
say that.
again,
What is the square footage that you're
well,
taxing?
I'm going to just go back to real estate tax for a second.
All right.
I'm believing that these guys know what they're doing. The owners, it's hard for me to believe you become a billionaire by not understanding how money works. So maybe.
Oh no, I would
So-
listen. They're not building this to lose money.
Right, so
They're
they're
building
spending.
it to make money.
so
They're
spending
going to make a lot.
Right, so if they're spending $1.5 billion, I have to believe it's worth at least $1 billion.
Okay.
If they were gonna pay the same real estate tax that everyone else has, based on the $1 billion assessment, they would be paying far more than what they're paying under the pilot.
Okay.
And
I
so
mean
we're-
that could be a fair statement
Right.
if it was the same use, right?
Well, it doesn't, again, use and occupancy tax is slightly different. Your point was they would get a 10-year tax.
Because would our arenas assess that?
Well,
so-
that's the question, right?
Right.
We don't know, but again, if they're spending $1.5 billion, it's hard for me to believe that it's not gonna.
Yeah, but is there value on the back end? Is the value in the building, or is the value having a building and owning a team and making your $4 billion product that you own now worth $7 billion because you have your own arena with your team, right? So I think that's, I mean, I don't know how they figure out their money. Obviously, these are smart people, and they do,
Right.
and they make a lot of money, so they're going to make money on. They're not going to build something where they lose money on.
Right.
But I think, you know, as a city, yeah, we would always love to have more tax revenue there. But I think when you're comparing it to other arenas and other stadiums, I think the city's, the way they looked at it and the way the administration looked at it was that this is more than all of them combined that are given to the city of Philadelphia without any city tax dollars, where we had tax dollars even in the previous stadium in 2001 that we put into those developments.
Well, I understand your point, but I do think that we are negotiating down from what they would have to pay otherwise.
But all right,
And so we are helping them. We're not giving them, we're not writing them a check.
No, but then are we going to gain other tax revenue and
Right.
in
So-
other ways?
So let's talk about that.
Okay.
But those become, I just want to make sure that what I'm saying.
It's the same thing. They're all speculating.
Right.
You're speculating, and you're going to
Right, but I
speculate
just-
on what they make.
I want to make sure that what we're telling people isn't wrong. So whether at the end it's going to make more
Well-
sense to do it or not,
Again, whether it's wrong, I'm not saying it's wrong or not, but it's compare. You have to be able to compare like situations, and if you compare a tower that's being built there for 1.5 billion, you're not going to pay U&O on that tower. You know what I mean? So you would get even less, right? So you would probably not even get $500,000 a year through U&O if it was a tower that was built there that was $1 billion. So when you're comparing those things, you have to have the actual details of what you're comparing it to really make that argument. So we could throw these numbers out there and say, well, yeah, that could be true, but maybe it's not true. So, and then if you're saying that's factual, that's not factual, well, they both could be factual, right? But depending on what you're comparing it to.
all right. Let me move on to the community benefits agreement, and
Okay.
I want to just focus for a second on not the argument of who's getting what. I want to just focus on the businesses in Chinatown. So the study that the city commission said there are 380 small businesses in Chinatown.
All right. We would like to thank Councilmember Mark Squilla for joining us on the program. We will have the rest of that interview next week on the show. So, Denise,
This is like bubblefish, the Japanese restaurant.
we've been dealing a lot with this these arena hearings this week. I think we have a little bit of feedback there or something.
Oh, excuse me.
So we've been in these hearings this week, and it was all day today, all day yesterday. It will be until 9 o'clock tomorrow night,
Mhm.
and it will be next week as well. So, Denise, what were some of the key things that you've taken away from this week's hearings?
Well, one thing I've taken away is that there are a lot of people who don't know how government works. And here is why I say that. The school district and council are two separate yet equally important groups, kind of like law and order. The council does stuff with city government, and the school board handles the school district. These are their stories. Clink, clink. And a lot of people kept conflating what the council needed to do and what the school district needed to do, particularly during public comment. Another thing that stood out to me is that there are a lot of wedges that have been thrown in during this debate. Like there's a wedge between folks in Chinatown, which are largely working class, and laborers who say we need this project to provide our members with work. There's a wedge that's kind of been thrown between the people who are, laborers and the people who are in like workers, like the Aramark workers, because Aramark's contract with the stadiums has still not been settled yet. And you have people who provide you with food at football games and basketball games and baseball games and hockey games that are still working without a contract. And in some cases, they're working at more than one venue. So you have that wedge. But the wedge, and it's a wedge that we've discussed a lot on the show, is the wedge between the Chinese and African American communities on this issue. And more than once, someone said, it's a shame that this has been allowed to become a wedge issue between these communities when we should be standing together. And what I felt like saying, and I couldn't say because I'm there covering this, is that you can't put a wedge where there isn't space. there is space between all of these places where there is now a wedge. And that space is generally there due to mistrust. You have to handle the mistrust issue if you want that wedge to close. And as several people testified yesterday, like Pastor Carl Day testified and said, you're thinking about everybody but Black men when you're doing this. And when you go to Chinatown, you don't see anybody who looks like me employed anywhere, which is also something that Samuel Staten Jr. of Labor's Local 332 said this morning when he testified. Basically, what you have here is something that's been brewing under the surface for a while now and is now bubbling up. What's going to be interesting is to see how it's not only handled in this case, but how it's handled long term, because you have other communities that are going to be, wedged out too. Like there's this perception that communities of color or people from traditionally marginalized communities should automatically band together, and that's the perception that would make sense. I kind of get tired as a Black woman being expected to fight everybody else for that little 10% of the pie that we are traditionally given. But this is another one of those things that is kind of going to be, an issue thanks to the presidential election, where you had roughly 90% of the African American community voting for Kamala Harris and trying to, keep Donald Trump and his baser impulses at bay, and they feel abandoned.
Yeah.
And the only other group that voted in the same way they did was the Jewish community. So you have this long-standing bubbling tension coupled with this abandonment, and you have something like some of the testimony we got during this hearing. Now, did it make sense necessarily? No, because basically you are supporting a stadium for a team that is currently 2-11 and whose former MVP center is being even more of a head case than usual right now. But you also can't expect people to come to your aid all the time when you're not necessarily coming to theirs.
I think one of the things that, and probably shouldn't surprise me, that has stuck out a lot are how many people are coming to testify. Community members, organizations, the Chinatown CDC.
Well, I think they organized very well. They organized all of their people to get their story out, and that's what you're supposed to do in a case like this.
But when they come, you almost unanimously they say we were not included in any of these discussions. We found out about it when everybody else found out.
Now, to be honest, I only halfway believe that. And the reason why I only halfway believe that is because this has been a discussion for the last 2 years. And it may not have included the people who were coming to testify, but you don't come up with a community a benefits agreement without talking to someone in that community. So it'll be interesting to see who from Washington Square West, who from the neighborhood, who from Chinatown comes out and says, I was in those meetings. Because
I'd love to know.
Somebody had to be. And another thing that stood out to me, if the folks from Chinatown and the neighborhood really want this stadium to be stopped successfully, they will tell the folks from Washington Square West to be quiet. They will tell them to sit down and be quiet and not say another blooming word. Because when the folks from Washington Square West testified, That was when my Twitter feed blew up talking about homophobia and racism. And, and in a sense of not in my backyard times 10. They're not helping you. If what you are trying to do is win the battle of public opinion, Washington Square West is not helping you. You might want to tell them to sit this one out.
Yeah, but another organization that was not included or consulted on the CBA. That's one of the most galling things about this for people. It's not only that it's happening, but it's okay. Well, if you want this thing to happen, talk to the people who live in those neighborhoods. And I don't have a hard time believing this, that they were not included. City Council wasn't included in any of this.
Well, again, this goes back to you and me and our incident with Sherelle Parker. This goes all the way back to that. I don't know why anyone would be at all surprised.
What incident is that again?
This is the ways that she did things.
Yeah.
Because it's not like we haven't been telling people that this is how she operates.
Yeah.
And the thing is, you may be able to get away with it in terms of doing interviews with the media. You may even be able to get away with it in terms of the city budget, even though you shouldn't try it. But there are certain things that you are just not going to be able to get away with doing things that way. And those things usually involve you putting things in other people's neighborhoods that they may not want.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to put a drug treatment center in Jeffrey Young's district without telling him. You're not going to be able to put a stadium in Mark Squilla's district without the community buy-in. You're not going to be able to do these things because you need to talk to people. But this is yet another example of how the communication in that communications office leaves a lot to be desired.
Right. The other thing that stood out is none of the experts who came out, the people who study arena economics, none of them said this was a good idea. And
well, they traditionally say it's not a good idea.
Right. And we've had a couple of those experts on the program. And, they just basically, and some of those people were testifying. And they said the same thing. These aren't good things for a downtown. Not just because of all the things we've talked about, but when you think about it, we talk about the the traffic. Well, where's the traffic going to go? It's not like it's right off I-95. It's not. You got to go through the city to get to this. And we know people are going to drive because public transportation won't be up to the challenge. We know that. But Denise, we did learn today that Center City has enough parking.
Well, the fact that information came from, I don't know, Parkway.
Yeah. The parking kingpins.
And the thing is, you can say that you have enough parking when you are basically the owner of 9/10 of the parking garages in the city.
Yeah.
You, if anyone would know we have enough parking, it would be you because you built it.
Yeah.
Granted, you charge like $11 billion for it.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found interesting is when he said he also did development, like affordable housing. And I'm like, okay, you did affordable housing with the parking garage.
Yeah.
Now, while I would appreciate, having an affordable housing unit with a parking garage, it goes back to who defines affordable.
Yeah.
And what definition you're using. Because the affordable for someone like Tyrese Maxey is going to be different than affordable for you and me.
Mm-hmm.
And, although I can't necessarily see Tyrese Maxey living on top of a parking lot, that's kind of the thing. And that's one problem that we have always had here in Philadelphia. Everybody's definition of affordable housing has always been different.
Yeah.
And nobody's matches. So it's going to be interesting to see how everything gets balanced, because you have the hospitality people that came up and said, we want the arena. You had the hotel people that came up and said, we want the arena. And yet you have these communities that are saying, no, no, no.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's going to be interesting to see what shakes up. But what will also be interesting is if that arena does not go up, you still have the problem of a section of the city that is making no money.
Yeah.
Office buildings are not going to go back to what they once were, because one thing that we all learned during the pandemic is the beauty of work-life balance.
Mm-hmm.
And we would rather work 3 days at home, 2 days in the office, be able to go see Bobby play football or Lizzie play field hockey. We would rather go and do that than spend like 40 hours a week at an office building, and then you got to somehow get home without feeling so exhausted that all you want to do is pass out, and you got to somehow get home with the public transportation that is, that, as Lance will probably tell us in a few minutes, has got some issues of its own it needs to work out. So they have to figure out what they're going to do with that section of Market Street, because it can't continue to go on like this.
Yeah, and we will have more on this next week, because that's when the hearings conclude. Now we're going to show you the first part of our interview with Councilmember Rue Landau discussing LGBTQ protections here in the city of Philadelphia. All right, Councilmember Rue Landau, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So our focus has shifted a little bit in light of last week's events. What was your reaction to last week's election results?
Probably pretty similar to anybody who was in our shoes, who was really fighting hard to make sure that we can continue having Democrats in charge federally, and also particularly someone like Kamala Harris, who is just really would have helped ensure and protect our civil rights. It's been kind of a tailspin. It feels like we're kind of in this downward spiral the more we're seeing, the next president's, again, appointments. None of it's a surprise. It really is just so concerning to watch not only somebody we know who was so disastrous for civil rights, civil liberties, for communities across America, including the LGBTQ community, immigrants, and so many other people. But to know that Project 2025 exists out there, to know they had a playbook of what they wanted to do next, and to watch his appointments now is just, looks like he's just putting the plan in effect, which means, as we know, it will probably be far worse for folks across the country than it was the first time around.
What are some of the key concerns about that the LGBTQ community has right now?
And I think people are scared to death, particularly the transgender and non-binary community. It is, Trump already started laying the foundation of giving people a license for hate, for bigotry, for discrimination against the community, going as far as, making it okay for people to, or thinking that it's okay for people to talk about banning books, banning rainbow flags, and really just trying to legislate against people's identities, right? If you look at it, for those of us who have been around in this world for a long time, helping to make sure that we're creating laws, for those of us who have been around for a long time, helping to build up and create the laws that are getting stronger to protect the LGBTQ community. We watched this in Philadelphia, this trajectory that got us to more rights, right? We included sexual orientation in our Fair Practices Ordinance in 1982, long before some other places did, across the country. We added gender identity in 2002. We are way ahead of the curve again. And we've been watching the federal government just slowly start to catch up to where we were as a city. Obviously, we had marriage equality start in Pennsylvania in May of 2014, later followed by federal government acknowledging marriage equality. My wife and I got the first same-sex marriage license in the state of Pennsylvania, building. And what happened from then is more of an acceptance of society, right? More of the community getting stronger, building up its rights, having the young people finally feel comfortable coming out, being themselves, including if they wanted to come out as non-binary or transgender. And what's happened from there is people feeling like they can be themselves and expressing themselves and showing the world who they are, which then turned from a backlash of Trump and the Republicans of saying, no, we're not going to let this happen. And that's when the laws and the policies and the regulations started to come out across the country, where there's like 500 or more pending, according to the ACLU, of pieces of legislation that are anti, non-binary and transgender people across the country, including, around 4 in Pennsylvania. And it's creeping up to us, right? We had trying to do book bans in Bucks County. Thankfully, we also have new school board members who said, no, this is not going to happen here. And I love that. But it shouldn't be this fight. It was amazing to watch. We're building on our rights, finally allowing people to really be themselves in the world, which has that power that we gained was obviously such a threat to people like Donald Trump and other right-wing Republicans across the country saying, nope, we're not going to let this happen. So it's a scary time. I don't think people should be thankfully, Philadelphia is a safe place. And thankfully, it is as safe as it can possibly be. We now have the difference between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0 is that he now has a Supreme Court that is allowing him to do a lot of what he wants to do. And that to me is the scariest part, because in Trump 1.0, he would have come down against trying to pass laws or policies, regulations against civil rights, civil liberties. And we had a Supreme Court that finally said, like, no, we're not going to let you go that far. We're not going to let you go that far. We don't have that protection anymore. And so to me, the absolute biggest fear that I have of Trump 2.0 is the Supreme Court saying, like, yeah, you can do this, you can do that, and rolling back our rights. It was already highlighted a little bit in the Dobbs decision that rolled back Roe versus Wade, so that young people with their reproductive choices now have fewer rights than we did in generations. You don't see, the Supreme Court has been building upon people's rights for so many years. And this was the first time that we saw rights taken away. And you saw Clarence Thomas and his concurring opinion say, yeah, we're going to start looking at the LGBTQ rights too, because we think these need to be rolled back as well. So again, the biggest fear I have is that our stopgap that was supposed to protect us is not there to protect us. And I spent a long time on the campaign trail trying to tell people, no matter what issues you have, focus on the Supreme Court. It is, the president has a lot of sway in making these choices, and we're in a pretty dangerous place. What I can say for Philadelphia, though, Philadelphia has incredibly strong laws, stronger laws than most places in America. I know that on the council side and on the administration side through the law department, we will do everything we possibly can to make sure that the LGBTQ community is protected here in Philadelphia. But there's definitely a different fear about what will happen to lawsuits as they go all the way up now that we didn't have before. We saw that in the Catholic Social Services case that got up to the U.S. Supreme Court, right? That was the case where the city said, if you're going to take our money and be a part of our child protective foster care system, we don't want you, Catholic Social Services, to have city money because you've already affirmatively said you will not place children in LGBTQ families. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, yep, religious freedom, they're allowed to do that. So again, the balance of the religious freedom versus LGBTQ rights is what is on the table here. And we should expect some pretty rough times ahead. Again, trying to be as positive that Philadelphia will protect you to every possible way we can.
Can you tell us a little bit about the hearing you convened a couple weeks ago that dealt with LGBTQ rights and protections?
Yeah. So I held the first ever hearing to just affirmatively invite the LGBTQ plus community in to talk about what are the obstacles and the barriers facing you for facing our community. I'm the first openly LGBTQ council person. I think we forgot to say that in the beginning. But I invited the community in, not on one particular issue or to just add a little piece to a larger issue. I wanted the community to come in and talk to me in terms of housing and education and employment. What are some of the barriers that are, facing the community in order to try to eradicate them so that the whole community can thrive? I very intentionally set the hearing centered around community. I did not ask the administration to testify. I asked them to come and listen. I sent them an invitation to come and listen to the community as they talked about, what it's like to be a young person in Philadelphia schools, feeling like Policy 252 is not being enforced across the board, what it's like to try to find housing if you're transgender, what it's like to try to find a job if you're transgender, and to just hear the real life stories of the obstacles folks are facing in order to, see what change can be made. Maybe it's legislation and maybe it's just enforcing policies that are already on the books.
All right, I'd like to bring you Denise Clay-Murray here on Philadelphia Hall Monitor.
Hi, Councilmember. We're really glad you took some time with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, when you look at because you're also involved with like AI and technology and stuff like that. When you look at like what do you have coming up on that horizon? And what can what can the city, expect? Because there's probably going to be some federal budget cuts that are going to hit us that are, in the areas of infrastructure. Has council thought about what they're going to do in light of that?
That's a great question. I do think one of our biggest concerns, excuse me, weather change. One of our biggest concerns going into this time and what will happen in January is that we likely will see significant federal cuts, budget cuts to the things that we care about so much in Philadelphia. I am the chair of the technology committee. I'm the co-chair of housing. I am the co-chair of a couple of others and on many, many others as well. And these are all, whether it's rec centers or libraries or really just investing in affordable housing. Philadelphia relies on our partners at the state and federal level to have adequate funding to get things done. We've been talking about the fiscal cliff that SEPTA is on. SEPTA really has such a budget gap that wasn't filled by the state, that needs to be filled by the state. that we will likely all be affected in Philadelphia very, very, very soon if we cannot fix this problem. These are the things that we're worried about starting in January, about what won't be funded. I am the chair of the tech committee, as I said, and I've held starting to look into AI and various other things, but I am really also interested in the ways in which all of these issues kind of come together, right? I think investment in our neighborhoods is extremely important to reduce violence and gun violence in neighborhoods. Very important that we continue to invest in our rec centers and libraries, and also making sure that people have really great paying jobs, and making sure that this ends up being, we do projects that are a win-win for so many others. So on October 24th, I gave an honor to the Sunrise Movement, a group of young people in Philadelphia who are working towards making sure that we are doing the best we can to focus on our climate crisis and to make great changes in our infrastructure in Philadelphia, so that we make sure that we are like reducing our carbon neutrality. I think this is a perfect example of what you're asking, Denise, about how all of these issues come together and how we can fund the groups and the things on the ground that end up benefiting all of Philadelphia. So the Sunrise Movement has long been saying that we have to invest in our rec centers, our libraries, green spaces, parks, because we have got a massive problem both with environmental racism and with greenhouse gases, and how we are heating up our world and causing a massive climate crisis. So they're looking at ways in which we can do investments, green investments, that are positive effect to all of us. So I not only honored them, but really focused also on the issues of State Rep Liz Fiedler started a program of solars for schools, putting solar panels on our schools in Philadelphia. Why not, right? They have great jobs. And this is a partnership between labor and green spaces, where organized labor gets to put the solar panels on roofs of schools, and we see a reduction on utility costs for the schools. And they've said within 20 years it pays for themselves, and obviously pays going forward tremendously in a variety of ways. That's been a pilot program that was, again, championed by State Rep Liz Fiedler, that I want to explore bringing to Philadelphia. I want to see if we can put solar panels on our rec centers and many of our libraries, to see what we can do to have a reduction in our greenhouse gases, great jobs, great labor, and also such a teaching moment for students. I bring this all together to tell you, who knew when I was announcing this on October 24th, that this is the project that I would really love to work on with a current president and hopefully the next president, who would be so focused on making sure that great union jobs and great green projects and reducing our carbon emissions were top tier issues that we're working on, to now come to today, where I think starting in January, we were going to have an administration that's focused on things very, very different from this. Will we be able to invest in the programs that we want to invest in? Will we have the federal funding to make this happen? This is a no-brainer. Putting solar panels on schools and then putting solar panels on rec centers and libraries, absolute no-brainer, win, win, win program. And we will see whether or not things like this can continue in the future.
All right. We'd like to thank Councilmember Rue Landau for joining us on the program. We'll have the rest of that interview next week on the show. And now we're going to bring in Lance Haver to tell us a little bit more about where we are with SEPTA.
Well, thank you. Those are really interesting interviews. And I am sorry, Councilman Squillick and Councilmember Landau gave us a lot of time. In the interview talking about the arena, SEPTA, when we filmed it, SEPTA had yet to announce that they're getting ready to enter a death spiral. And not only are they seeking fare increases, but they're seeking massive service cuts. In the future, one of the questions to ask is, as the team owners claim that 40% of the people who attend the arena will be riding public transit, I think we should ask how those people are going to ride public transit if SEPTA no longer has evening service. That being said, the SEPTA board meets tomorrow at 3 o'clock, and it is the beginning of the end. SEPTA will vote on the first of 2 fare increases. This is one that will raise roughly $7 million. And if they do pass this, they will then in December have a hearing on a second fare increase. The total of the 2 fare increases will be a 45% increase that's unheard of, never been tried before, largest in the history of public transit. It is so apparent that the riders are opposed to this that the SEPTA board has scheduled the hearings for when people can attend. SEPTA board meets tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Now we'll be there and we'll speak to it. But the public, quote unquote, public hearing on the next round of fare increases will be at 10 o'clock in the morning and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. In every past year, they've held hearings in the evening so working people can get to them. This year, they've decided not to do that any longer. No more evening hearings. Second, without much notice, they decided that what they've been using for the last decade for the hearing room is no longer sufficient, and they've moved it from 1234 Market Street to the convention center. So unless people are paying attention to that, I believe people are going to show up at 1234 Market Street to try and speak. And of course, they're not going to be allowed in because the hearing's been moved. The issue for the SEPTA board is very simple. What should it do? They have a promise from 2 years ago with Governor Shapiro saying he was going to find the money to bail them out. He did not. He traded it for other things in the budget. Last budget season, Governor Shapiro promised that he would bail out public transit, not just SEPTA, but every public transit system in the state. And once again, Governor Shapiro reneged. And he said, don't worry, he'll take care of it in the fall after the election in the lame duck session. And once again, he reneged. Now, I'd like to just compare how public transit riders, who now, again, these are generalizations, so it's not true for any individual, but on average, the people who use public transit are people who are experiencing poverty. According to the Pew Charitable Trust, over 45% of the riders of SEPTA make less than $25,000 a year. So that would put you in an economically struggling area. When it came time to fix I-95, I think most of us remember seeing Governor Shapiro and his windbreaker and his staff, and they all, not going to use the language that he used, but they were all bragging, we get S done. Mm-hmm. And, he goes on television talking about the election for presidency, saying, he is a different type of Democrat because he gets S done. Well, when it comes to representing poor people and riders in public transit, he didn't get anything done, and he has completely turned his back on the city and on the region. And the question remains, will the SEPTA board say that's okay? And here's their choice. The SEPTA board has over $500 million in this fare stabilization fund, which we've spoken about. They can continue to draw that money down every year for at least the next 2 years without raising fares and without cutting service. And at the end of those 2 years, they won't have any money left. Or they can deliver a message to Governor Shapiro and say, don't worry, you don't have to do anything because we, SEPTA, are going to start to dismantle the system on our own. We know that if we take these steps, we will be dismantling the system. Here's where it gets so crazy. SEPTA's staff says, if the SEPTA board does what SEPTA staff asks for, raise fares twice in 1 year, cut service by 20 to 25%, SEPTA will be unreliable, and SEPTA will enter what's called a death spiral, meaning every time they raise fares, the actual increase in revenues will go down, so they'll have to raise fares again or cut more service. That's what SEPTA staff says their own proposal will do. And here's the choice the board makes. Do they say, we refuse to dismantle the SEPTA system and hold Governor Shapiro accountable for his promises and for the region? Or do they say, you know what? We're not going to ask the governor to be accountable because the governor, like the people who is the chairman of the board, are Democrats and they don't want to expose him to the 2 year ago misstatement, to last year's misstatement, to this year's misstatement. Instead, they would rather injure the riders themselves than put the burden and to put the correct story forward that the governor, who is sitting on literally billions of dollars in unspent money, is unwilling to use the political capital to save the riders. Happy to use it to save the drivers, the commuters, the people from the suburbs who are driving into the city, but not willing to use it for the riders who ride the buses and the trolleys and the L and the Broad Street line in the city, not willing to use the capital for that.
Wow.
So
It is somewhat
But-
remarkable. You know, if President-elect Trump took office on January 20th, and when he said he's going to be a dictator, and one of the first things he did was he said, I'm going to dismantle public transit in Philadelphia because, quote unquote, bad things happen in Philadelphia. I'm going to start to wind down the public transit system, SEPTA. I'm going to underfund it. I'm going to order 45% fare increases. I'm going to order 25% service cuts. Every single Democrat on city council, the mayor, every single Democrat in southeastern Pennsylvania would be up in arms screaming, you can't do that to us. You can't hurt us that way. But they are completely silent as the governor goes forward with this plan. And it's not that they can't do anything, because that's not true. The city of Philadelphia has 2 representatives to the SEPTA board. And because the city is the largest part, 80% of the riders, 80% of the local match, 80% of the systems actually in the city officers, the city board members have the right to veto any proposal. If the city decided that it didn't want to put the burden on the working poor, it would simply veto these fare increases, veto the service cuts, and force the governor to come forward or to say he doesn't care about us. Again, if President-elect Trump did this, the day after he takes office, uses his dictatorial power to dismantle public transit, people in City Hall would be screaming. But when a Democratic governor turns his back on us, nobody says anything.
Yeah.
That's an overstatement. They do send a very polite letter saying, please don't forget us. But they will not use their power to stop the fare increases. They will not use their power to stop funding SEPTA. They will not use their power to protect us.
So who are the Philadelphia members of the board? Do you know?
I do. One is the deputy mayor who's been testifying at city council on the behalf of the Sixers. And for some reason, he seems to have forgotten that before him is a proposal to eliminate the night service on SEPTA. And he's the one who's saying, well, don't worry about the streets. Don't worry about parking because SEPTA is going ahead and taking 40% of the attendance to the game. So we know that the mayor's appointment to the board, the other appointment to the board is not somebody who may know as much as the deputy mayor does. But these are all things, in my opinion, that should be known. And the deputy mayor definitely knows. And if you sat through those council hearings on the arena, you should know that SEPTA is a tremendously important issue. If you read the arena report, you'll see that the Sixers are claiming, it's unbelievable. I'm laughing because it's just so incredibly untrue that 40% of the people who attend the games are going to use public transit. And now they're not going to be able to. So that's where it stands. I'll be at the board meeting tomorrow. I'll come back and report on it. Hopefully before the hearings in December, I'll get a chance to talk a little more about it. And maybe we'll be able to get some of the city council people to explain why they don't order their representatives to veto the proposal.
All right, we'll be back next week with the continuation of our interviews with council members Landau and Squilla, and we'll see you next week on Hall Monitor.
Forgive me, folks.